Rain had been falling over Manhattan for 3 straight days when Clara Whitfield walked into the Mercer Tower lobby and asked for a job application. She didn't ask for the front desk position, even though the young woman behind the marble counter was clearly overwhelmed and struggling to manage 4 phone lines at once. She didn't ask about the marketing coordinator role advertised on the glass door outside, even though Clara had spent 4 years studying communications at Ohio State before life interrupted everything. She asked for the janitor application, the one taped to the inside of the service entrance on West 47th Street, written in plain black ink on a half sheet of paper, the kind of posting that most people walked past without a second glance. The receptionist, a redhead named Penny with shellac nails and a sympathetic frown, looked at Clara for a long moment before sliding a single-page form across the counter. "Custodial Services reports to the 3rd floor," Penny said carefully, "but the position is overnight, 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. Is that going to work for you?" "It's perfect," Clara said, and she meant it. She took the form to one of the leather chairs near the lobby window and filled it out with a pen she'd borrowed from Penny. Outside, the rain slid down the glass in uneven rivers, blurring the yellow cabs and the grey coats of people rushing past. Clara wrote her name slowly and deliberately at the top of the form, the way her mother had taught her. Capital C, a clean loop on the L, no careless shortcuts. Clara Ann Whitfield. Then her address, a room she rented week to week above a laundromat in Queens, her availability, her emergency contact, and in the small box labeled Previous Experience, she wrote, General cleaning, food service, elder care, reliable, detail-oriented, available immediately. She did not write about Columbus. She did not write about what happened 2 years ago. She left that part of herself behind in Ohio, folded up like an old letter she no longer had the heart to reread. Penny processed the form without much conversation, stamped it with a date, and told Clara she'd receive a call within 5 business days. Clara thanked her, returned the pen, and walked back out into the rain. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that her application would never reach the custodial department. Mercer Capital occupied the top 12 floors of Mercer Tower, and it was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most powerful private equity firms in the country. Its founder, Nathan Mercer, had built it from a single office in Midtown with borrowed money and an almost irrational confidence in his own instincts. He was 38 now, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that made people assume he had never struggled for anything in his life. Those people were wrong, but Nathan had learned long ago that correcting assumptions was a waste of energy better spent elsewhere. He arrived at the office every morning at 6:30, before his assistant, before the cleaning crew, before anyone else who worked in the building. He liked the silence of those early hours, the way the city sprawled below the floor-to-ceiling windows, like something he had personally arranged, every light placed exactly where it belonged. His office on the 44th floor had a view of both the Hudson and the East River on a clear day. On rainy days like this one, it had a view of nothing but clouds, which Nathan sometimes preferred. Clouds didn't need managing. His assistant, Marcus, a compact and efficient man of 30, who had worked for Nathan for 6 years and never once been late, arrived at 7 sharp with a coffee and a printed summary of the morning's agenda. "You have the Keller Group at 9, Marcus said, setting the coffee on the corner of the desk. "The Berlin call at 11:30, and HR sent up a batch of applications for the building staff positions. Facilities asked you to sign off on the final round, since they're bringing someone in who will have overnight access to the trading floor records room." Nathan waved his hand in a gesture that meant leave them on the desk, and Marcus did exactly that before retreating to his own glass-walled office outside. The applications sat in a manila folder for most of the morning. Nathan didn't touch them during the Keller meeting, didn't touch them during the Berlin call, didn't think about them at all until nearly 1 in the afternoon when he finally sat down with his lunch, a sandwich Marcus had ordered, untouched and slightly cold, and reached for the folder out of habit, the way some men reach for their phones. There were 7 applications inside. He flipped through them quickly, barely reading, looking only for the basic criteria Marcus had already flagged in yellow highlighter. Clean record, verifiable references, available for overnight hours. 6 of them were straightforward, unremarkable. He initialed each one without stopping. Then he pulled out the seventh. He almost initialed it too. His pen was already moving toward the bottom of the page when his eyes landed on the name at the top, and something inside him went completely, abruptly still. Clara Ann Whitfield. Nathan Mercer did not move for a full 10 seconds. The pen hovered over the paper. His sandwich sat forgotten at his elbow. Outside, the rain continued its indifferent percussion against the glass, and the city below moved and hummed and breathed, without pausing to notice that something had just shifted, quietly and irrevocably, in an office 44 floors above it. He read the name again. Then a third time. His jaw tightened. He set the pen down. There were things Nathan Mercer controlled: his schedule, his investments, the temperature of his office, the mood of every room he walked into. There were things he did not control, and chief among them was the particular feeling that arrived now in the center of his chest. Tight, old, specific, like pressing a finger against a bruise that had never fully healed. He knew that name. He had known it for 15 years. He picked up the phone and called Marcus. "The 7th application in the HR folder," he said when Marcus answered on the first ring. "Clara Whitfield. I want you to pull whatever contact information she provided and have her come in. Not for the custodial position." A brief pause. What position then? Nathan looked back down at the paper, at the neat, careful handwriting, at the small, honest box of previous experience, elder care, food service, reliable, and something about its plainness made his chest feel tighter than before. "Tell her it's for a building coordinator role," he said. "Tell her we'd like to speak with her in person. Should I mention the salary range? It's considerably more than—" "Just get her in," Nathan said. And then, more quietly, to himself rather than to Marcus, "I need to see her face." He hung up. He stood and walked to the window where the clouds had thickened into something dark and low, pressing against the city like a held breath. He pressed 2 fingers to the glass, and the cold of it ran straight up his arm. 15 years. Clara Whitfield had been 18 the last time Nathan saw her. She had been standing in a hospital corridor in Columbus, Ohio, wearing a yellow sweater, and she had been crying in that completely silent way that certain people cry. No sound, no performance, just tears falling one after another down a face that had already made up its mind to survive whatever came next. He had walked away from her that night. He had told himself he had no choice. He had been telling himself that for 15 years, and on most days he almost believed it. But her name on a job application, a janitor application, in his building, in his lobby, was not something that happened by accident, or if it did, Nathan Mercer was not the kind of man who let accidents go unexamined. He turned away from the window. He picked up his pen. He did not initial her form. Instead, he wrote 4 words in the margin in handwriting nothing like Clara's careful loops. Set the meeting. Priority. Clara received the call on a Thursday morning, while she was standing in the laundromat below her room, watching a dryer spin a load of clothes she'd worn 4 days in a row because she hadn't had quarters until Tuesday. The number on her screen showed a Manhattan area code she didn't recognize, and she almost let it go to voicemail. She'd been letting a lot of calls go to voicemail lately, a habit she'd developed in Columbus when the calls were never good news. She answered on the 4th ring. "Ms. Whitfield." The voice was male, efficient, pleasant in a professional way. "My name is Marcus Webb. I'm calling on behalf of Mercer Capital. You submitted an application earlier this week through our building services portal." "I did," Clara said carefully. "We'd like to invite you in for a conversation, not for the custodial position, actually. We have a building coordinator role that we believe may be a stronger fit based on your application. It's a daytime position, Monday through Friday. The salary is considerably more competitive." Clara watched the dryer spin. One of her sweaters, the beige one, the only nice thing she still owned, pressed itself flat against the glass and then tumbled away. "I applied for the janitor job," she said. "Yes, ma'am. We're aware. Mr. Mercer reviewed all building staff applications personally and felt your profile warranted a different conversation." Something in that sentence snagged. Mr. Mercer reviewed them personally. She knew enough about how large firms operated to know that the founder of a private equity company did not personally review custodial applications. She'd spent enough time around offices before Columbus, before everything collapsed, to understand that. "What's the coordinator role, Fiato?" she asked. Marcus explained it with practiced clarity, managing building access schedules, coordinating between facilities and executive staff, acting as a liaison for vendors and contractors who came through the tower. It was organized, detail-oriented work, reliable hours, benefits after 60 days. Clara said she'd come in Friday at 10. She hung up and stood very still while the dryer finished its cycle, and she tried to identify the feeling moving through her. Not quite hope, not quite suspicion, something unsteady that lived between the two. She had learned over the past 2 years to be careful with hope. Hope had a way of presenting itself as something solid right up until the moment it wasn't. She arrived at Mercer Tower 12 minutes early, wearing the beige sweater and a pair of dark slacks she'd pressed the night before with an iron borrowed from her landlord. She'd pulled her light brown hair back simply, and she wore the small gold pendant her mother had given her, a circle, plain and unadorned, because it was the only piece of jewelry she had left and because it made her feel on difficult mornings that she was not entirely without an anchor. Penny at the front desk recognized her with a small, genuine smile. "They're expecting you on 44, she said. "Elevators are on your right." Clara rode up alone. The elevator was mirrored on 3 sides, and she watched her own reflection in triplicate. 3 versions of a woman who had once had a different life, standing straight because standing straight was the only option she'd ever known to work. Marcus met her at the elevator doors. He was exactly as his voice suggested, compact, efficient, genuinely kind in a way that felt institutional rather than personal. He walked her through a hallway where the walls held large-scale black and white photographs of city skylines, Chicago, London, Tokyo, São Paulo. The carpet was the color of slate. Everything about the space communicated controlled power, and Clara kept her eyes level and her breathing even. Marcus showed her to a glass-walled conference room and offered her water, which she accepted. He told her Mr. Mercer would be with her shortly and then disappeared, pulling the door closed behind him with a soft, expensive click. Clara sat. She looked at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The clouds had finally broken, and Manhattan was doing its best impression of something magnificent, all silver light and vertical ambition. She pressed her hands flat on the table in front of her and focused on the sensation of cool glass beneath her palms. She was still focused on the table when the door opened. She looked up, and for a moment, just a moment, the room seemed to tilt slightly on its axis, the way rooms do when the brain receives information that the body hasn't yet decided how to process. Nathan Mercer was taller than she remembered. His shoulders were broader, his hair was darker and shorter, and there was a beard now, close-cropped and neat, that hadn't been there before. He was wearing a black suit with the collar open, no tie, and a watch on his left wrist that caught the light as he reached for the back of the chair across from her. But his eyes were exactly the same, dark, direct, and carrying something behind them that Clara had spent years trying to forget. He stopped when he saw her face. Not a dramatic stop, not the kind you'd notice if you were watching from the hallway. Just a half-second's hesitation, a barely perceptible pause like a man who had prepared himself for something and then discovered the preparation was not quite enough. "Clara," he said. Not Ms. Whitfield, not the professional greeting she'd been expecting. Just her name in a voice that was older and quieter than the one she remembered, and somehow exactly the same. "Nathan," she said. He sat down. Neither of them spoke for a moment that stretched far longer than was comfortable. Then Nathan said, "You applied for a janitor position in my building." "I needed a job," Clara said simply. "I didn't know it was your building." He watched her. She could see him deciding whether to believe that, turning it over behind those dark eyes. "How long have you been in New York?" he asked. 4 months. "Where before that?" "Columbus," she said. "Until I wasn't." Something moved across his face at the word Columbus, a flicker she couldn't fully read. He folded his hands on the table. His knuckles were white at the edges, which was the only visible sign that this conversation was costing him something. "The coordinator position is real," he said. "I didn't invent it to get you in here." "I didn't think you invented it," Clara said, though she had a little. "The salary is $68,000 to start. Full benefits. You'd report to Marcus day to day." He paused. But I want to ask you something first, and I want you to know you're not obligated to answer it. Clara waited. Why here? Nathan asked. New York is a big city. There are 100 buildings you could have walked into. She held his gaze. 15 years sat between them like a river, wide, cold, and full of things that had never been said out loud. I walked past your lobby in the rain, she said. I saw the sign on the service door. I needed work and I didn't care what kind. She let a breath go. I didn't know it was yours, Nathan. I promise you that. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded, once the way he used to nod when he was accepting something he hadn't expected to accept. There's something else, he said. Something I should have told you a long time ago, and I think, before you decide whether you want this job or not, you need to hear it. Clara felt the pendant cool against her collarbone. She pressed her fingertip to it, that small golden circle, and thought of her mother. I'm listening, she said. Nathan opened his mouth, and then his phone buzzed on the table, once, twice, a third time in rapid succession, and Marcus's voice came through the door. Nathan, it's the Dalton situation. It can't wait. Nathan's jaw tightened. He looked at his phone, then back at Clara, with an expression she recognized instantly even after 15 years. The look of a man caught between two things he couldn't hold at once. Give me 10 minutes, he said, standing. Of course, Clara said. He walked out. The door closed. Clara sat alone in the conference room, 44 floors above Manhattan, with the city glittering beyond the glass, and the question of what Nathan Mercer had been about to say hanging in the air like smoke, present, shapeless, and impossible to ignore. She picked up her water glass. Her hand was not quite steady. She had told him the truth. She hadn't known this was his building. But sitting here now, with his voice still warm in her ears, and that old familiar ache pressing quietly against her ribs, she was beginning to wonder if some part of her, some deep, stubborn, unreasonable part, had known exactly where her feet were taking her when she walked in out of the rain. The 10 minutes Nathan promised turned into 45. Clara knew this not because she watched the clock on the wall. She deliberately kept her eyes away from it. But because the light coming through the conference room windows shifted twice, moving from the sharp silver of late morning into the softer, warmer tone of early afternoon. Manhattan rearranged its shadows below her, and she sat with her water glass and her thoughts and the particular stillness of someone who has learned, through necessity, how to wait without falling apart. Marcus appeared at the 30-minute mark with a quiet knock and an apologetic expression that told her everything she needed to know about how often this happened. He's still tied up, Marcus said. There's a situation with one of our portfolio companies. Nothing that involves you, I promise. Can I bring you anything? Coffee? Lunch? I'm fine, Clara said. Thank you, Marcus. He hesitated at the door. For what it's worth, he said. He cleared his entire afternoon for this meeting. He doesn't do that. Clara looked at him carefully. Marcus had the face of someone who said precisely what he meant, and not a word more. She nodded, and he left. She stood and walked to the window. 44 floors down, she could see the corner of West 47th Street where the service entrance was, where the small handwritten sign had been taped inside the glass, the one that had pulled her out of the rain and into a building that turned out to belong to the last person she had expected. She pressed her forehead lightly against the cool glass, just for a second, and let herself think about Columbus. She didn't do that often. She'd built her days in New York specifically to avoid it. The busyness of survival was a surprisingly effective substitute for actual peace of mind. But standing in Nathan Mercer's conference room, with his voice still finding its way through 15 years of careful silence, she let herself go back. She had been 23 when it all came apart, not 18. That was when she'd first met Nathan, when they were both students at Ohio State, thrown together by a shared professor and a study group that met every Thursday in the campus library. Nathan had been brilliant and restless, and full of a hunger she'd found both thrilling and slightly frightening. She'd been steadier than him, more patient, more methodical, and they had balanced each other in the way that certain people do, the kind of balance that feels inevitable in retrospect. They had dated for 2 years, They had talked about the future with the particular confidence of young people who had not yet learned what the future was capable of doing. And then Nathan's father had gotten sick. Robert Mercer's illness had come fast and aggressive, a cardiac condition that required expensive intervention and constant monitoring. Nathan had thrown himself into finding a solution the way he threw himself into everything, completely, almost violently. He'd dropped out of his final semester, taken a job in finance in New York, started building the career that would eventually become Mercer Capital. And in the process, he had slowly, and then all at once, stopped calling. Clara had not understood it at the time. She had tried to for months, had written letters he didn't answer, had called numbers that eventually stopped connecting, had told herself there were 100 reasonable explanations for a person going silent. People got overwhelmed. People got scared. People sometimes disappeared not because they wanted to, but because they didn't know how to stay. Then one night, 6 months after Nathan had effectively vanished from her life, she had received a call from a mutual friend. The friend had been awkward and uncomfortable on the phone. The way people are when they're delivering information, they were asked to deliver by someone who didn't have the courage to do it directly. Nathan had married someone else, a woman named Diane from a wealthy Connecticut family. The wedding had been small, private, and, the friend said apologetically, entirely Nathan's choice. Clara had stood in her apartment kitchen and listened to this information and felt something inside her go very quiet and very cold. She had never called him again. She had moved forward with her life, finished her degree, took a communications job at a mid-size firm in Columbus, built something small and functional out of the wreckage. She had even, in the 5 years that followed, met someone else. A kind man named Daniel who loved her steadily and without drama, which she had come to believe was what she wanted. Then Daniel had been in the accident. A truck running a red light on a Tuesday afternoon, while he was walking back from the pharmacy with her prescription. He had survived, barely then fully, then with a long and grueling recovery that had consumed 2 years and every resource either of them had. When he finally healed, he had looked at Clara across their kitchen table and told her with great gentleness that he loved her, but that he needed to find himself again, and that he didn't think he could do that with her. She had not fought it. She'd been too tired to fight. So she had come to New York, and she had walked into the rain, and she had seen a sign on a service door. That was all. Nathan came back at 12:47. He walked through the conference room door without knocking, set his jacket over the back of his chair, and sat down with the look of a man who had sprinted through a fire and come out the other side still holding the thing he'd gone in to save. "I'm sorry," he said, and the way he said it, direct, no decorative language, told her he meant both the 45 minutes and something considerably larger. "It's all right," Clara said. "It's not, actually." He looked at her. "None of it has been all right for a very long time, and I'd rather not keep pretending otherwise." Clara set her water glass down carefully. "Nathan, I left Diane 3 years ago," he said. "I want you to know that before I say anything else. The marriage ended because it should never have started." Clara was quiet. "She was my father's choice," Nathan said. "Not mine. When my father got sick, he made a condition. His financial contacts, the network he'd built over 40 years, would only become available to me if I made what he called a suitable commitment. He had very specific ideas about what that meant." He paused. "Diane's family had money and connections. My father was dying and I was 24, and I made the worst decision of my life because I told myself I didn't have another option." Clara felt the words land one by one, like stones dropping into still water. "You could have told me why," she said. Her voice was even. She had been keeping her voice even all morning. "I know. You could have called. You could have explained. Instead, you just—" She stopped, breathed. "You disappeared, Nathan. And then 6 months later, I found out from someone else that you were married. Do you understand what that was like?" "Yes," he said. "And then, no. I know I don't fully understand it, but I've thought about it every day for 15 years and I understand enough. Silence opened between them. Not hostile, but serious, the kind of silence that two adults construct carefully around the most fragile things. "Why am I here?" Clara asked. "In this room? Why did you pull my application out of the pile and change the job and call me up here?" Nathan's hands were flat on the table. He looked at them as though they belonged to someone he was still learning to trust. "Because when I saw your name," he said slowly, "I realized that I have been telling myself a story for 15 years about why I did what I did and why it was necessary and why you were probably better off without the version of me that existed back then." He raised his eyes. "And I realized I have no idea if any of it is true, because I never asked you." Clara stared at him. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said quickly. "That's not what this is. I didn't bring you up here to make myself feel better. I brought you up here because you deserve to say whatever you need to say, to my face, and I should have given you that a long time ago." The afternoon light was warm and flat across the table between them. Clara thought about the laundromat. She thought about the beige sweater in the dryer. She thought about Daniel's gentle voice across a kitchen table, and her mother's gold pendant, and a hospital corridor in Columbus that she had walked through alone. She thought about the 18-year-old girl in the campus library, who had looked across a table piled with textbooks and seen a restless, brilliant boy who looked at her like she was the most interesting thing in the room. "There's something I haven't told you either," Clara said. Nathan went still. "When you disappeared," she said carefully, I wasn't only grieving the relationship." She touched the pendant at her throat. "I was pregnant, Nathan. I lost the baby at 11 weeks, but for 2 months I was going to have your child, and you didn't know, and I couldn't reach you, and Her voice held. She had practiced holding it for 15 years. "I handled it alone," she finished, "and I survived it, but you should know." The color left Nathan Mercer's face so completely and so suddenly that Clara reached across the table, not thinking, just moving, and pressed her hand over his. Nathan did not speak for a long time. Clara watched him absorb it, watched the information move through him the way a tremor moves through solid ground, invisible at the surface until it isn't. His jaw worked once, twice. His eyes dropped to their hands on the table, her fingers over his, and he did not pull away, which she had half expected him to do. Instead, he turned his hand slowly beneath hers until his palm was facing up, and he held on with the careful, deliberate grip of someone who has just understood that they are standing at the edge of something irreversible. "I didn't know," he said finally. His voice was low and stripped of everything professional. "I know you didn't," Clara said. "That doesn't make it better." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't, but it's still true." He raised his eyes to hers. She had expected many things from this moment. Anger at herself for saying it, relief, the complicated satisfaction of finally handing something heavy to the person who had helped create it. What she had not expected was how young he suddenly looked. Not young the way he'd been at 22, restless and hungry and sure of himself. Young the way people look when they are confronted with a grief they were not present for and cannot go back and share. A particular helpless kind of young. "I'm sorry," he said. It was different from the apology he'd offered when he came back into the room. That one had been about the 45 minutes. This one came from somewhere much further down. Clara nodded. She let the silence hold for a moment, and then she gently withdrew her hand. Not coldly, just returning to herself, re-establishing the borders she'd spent 2 years carefully rebuilding. "I didn't tell you to punish you," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I told you because you said I deserved to say what I needed to say, and that was one of the things I needed to say." She smoothed her hand flat on the table. "I've carried it for a long time. It's lighter now. That's enough." Nathan looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully name, something that lived between devastation and the first tentative suggestions of relief. He pressed his fingers briefly against his eyes, then dropped his hands and sat up straighter. "What happened to you after Columbus?" he asked, not prying, asking the way someone asks when they genuinely need to understand the shape of what they missed. Clara told him. Not everything, not all at once, but the outline. The communications job, the slow rebuilding, Daniel, the accident, the quiet and gutting end of that relationship. The decision to leave Ohio entirely, to start over somewhere that didn't already know her story. The room above the laundromat in Queens. The rain. Nathan listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. He had learned that much at least, and when to be quiet. When she finished, he said, "You're one of the strongest people I've ever known." "I'm a person who kept moving," Clara said. "Most people do eventually. Most people don't do it with as much grace as you're sitting here showing right now." She almost smiled. "Don't make me a symbol, Nathan. I'm just a woman who needs a job." Something shifted in his expression, lighter, careful, like the first crack in ice, not because it's breaking, but because the temperature is finally, slowly rising. "The coordinator position," he said. "It's genuinely yours if you want it. No conditions, no complications. Marcus would be your direct supervisor. You'd barely see me." He paused. "That's not a selling point or a warning. It's just the truth of how the role works." Clara considered it. $68,000 was not a fortune in New York, but it was a foundation, real, solid, the kind she hadn't had in 2 years. Benefits after 60 days, reliable hours, a reason to press her slacks and borrow an iron and take the subway into Manhattan each morning like a person who belonged somewhere. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Anything. Did you pull my application because you wanted to apologize, or because you wanted something else?" Nathan didn't hesitate. "Both," he said. "I wanted to apologize because it was long overdue, and I've done a lot of work on myself in the 3 years since the divorce, and the thing I kept coming back to was you, the way I handled it, what I took from you by disappearing." He held her gaze. "And yes, I wanted to see you. I won't pretend that wasn't part of it. But I'm not asking you for anything, Clara. I want to be very clear about that. I don't think I've earned the right to ask you for anything." Clara looked at him for a long moment, at the man who was and wasn't the boy she'd loved in a campus library, at the older, quieter version of that relentless hunger she'd once found so magnetic. She thought about the girl she'd been. She thought about who she was now. "Take the job," her instinct said, not because of Nathan, but because of the view from this window, and the salary, and the way Marcus had knocked gently and brought her water, and the small gold pendant that meant keep going. "I'll take the job," she said. Nathan exhaled. "Good. On one condition." He raised an eyebrow. "We don't pretend this conversation didn't happen," she said. "We don't perform normalcy. If we're going to be in the same building, we're going to be honest. No more disappearing into silence." "Agreed," he said immediately, and then quietly, "I've had enough of silence." The weeks that followed were not a fairy tale. Clara was clear-eyed enough to know that real things didn't move the way fairy tales did. They moved the way rivers moved, sometimes slow and sometimes suddenly fast, always shaped by what they encountered along the way. She learned the building. She memorized the vendor schedules and the access protocols and the names of every security guard on the overnight rotation, because she was the kind of person who learned names. Marcus turned out to be an extraordinary colleague, dry-humored, competent, and constitutionally incapable of office drama, which Clara considered a gift from the universe. She found a better apartment at the end of her second month, a studio in Astoria, with a window that faced east and caught the morning light in a way that made getting up feel like a reasonable thing to do. She bought herself a second sweater, then a third. Small victories, accumulated deliberately. Nathan she saw in the hallways, in the elevator, at the building-wide meetings Marcus organized quarterly. He always nodded. She always nodded back. They were, against all reasonable odds, civil. Genuinely civil, not the performative kind. Twice he stopped to ask how she was settling in, and both times she told him the truth, and both times he listened like someone who had made a private promise to himself about listening. 6 weeks in, he appeared at the door of her small office. She had a real office now, glass-walled, with her name on a plaque, and held up 2 cups of coffee. "Penny told me you take it with 1 sugar," he said. "She's been keeping notes on everyone in this building for years. I find it both alarming and deeply useful." Clara laughed. It surprised her, not the laugh itself, but how easy it was, how it came without calculation. She took the coffee. He sat across from her, and they talked for 20 minutes about nothing important: a neighborhood restaurant Marcus had recommended, a water pressure issue on the 39th floor that had consumed most of Clara's Tuesday. It was ordinary conversation, embarrassingly, almost painfully ordinary. And in its ordinariness, it was the most honest thing she'd had in years. The coffee visits became a Tuesday ritual, then Tuesday and Thursday, then sometimes Friday if neither of them had somewhere to be. They did not rush toward anything. Neither of them reached across the space between their chairs, but the space became familiar, and familiar was its own kind of tender. One afternoon in November, 4 months after Clara had walked into the lobby in the rain, Nathan set down his coffee cup and said, "I'd like to take you to dinner. Not as colleagues, I want to be honest about what I mean." Clara looked at him across the small distance of her office. Through the glass wall, she could see the city doing what it always did, moving, insisting on itself, indifferent to the particular weight of this particular moment. She thought about the girl who had sat in a hospital corridor in a yellow sweater, crying without sound. She thought about the woman who had filled out a job application in neat, careful handwriting and asked only for work she could rely on. She thought about all the versions of herself she had carried through 15 years of life and how none of them had been wrong. They had all just been earlier. "I'd like that," she said. Nathan smiled, a real one, the unself-conscious kind she hadn't seen since they were 22, and arguing about literature in a library that always smelled like old paper and radiator heat. It transformed his face entirely. "Friday?" he said. "Friday," she said. He stood to leave, and at the door he paused, the same pause she had noticed in the conference room on the first day, that barely perceptible beat of a man checking himself against what he'd prepared for. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think you're the bravest person I've ever met. Not because of what you survived, because of how you walked into this building and told me the truth and still chose to stay." Clara picked up her coffee cup. The morning light caught the gold pendant at her throat. "You told me something true too," she said. "That matters." He nodded. And this time, when he walked away, he did not disappear. He turned left at the end of the hallway, toward his own office, toward the city-facing window and the life he had built. And she could see him through the glass walls the whole way there. That was the difference, she thought. 15 years ago, she had watched him walk away, and the hallway had swallowed him. Now there were glass walls, and she could see exactly where he was going, and the transparency of it was enough, for now, to build something real upon. Outside, Manhattan moved and breathed in the November cold. Clara Whitfield, who had once applied for a janitor job in the rain, who had survived more than anyone had ever asked her to survive, who had pressed her name in neat, careful letters onto a half sheet of paper without knowing it would find its way to the one person she had never been able to stop carrying, opened her planner and wrote Friday on the next clean page. Then she picked up her pen and got back to work.